Paul, thank you so much for the kind introduction. I have to say what Paul said about having a conversation with his child about being autistic is particularly one that resonates with me. I mean, my son was diagnosed when he was 3, he's now 16, and we told him when he was 9, and we were so worried about how's he going to react, is this going to just put him into a different mindset? But he embraced it brilliantly. The more challenging conversation was when I told him he had to be a Tottenham fan. That was by far more challenging than telling him he was autistic, just so you know. So yeah, Paul, thank you for sharing, it's brilliant. So, okay, let's move through this. I promise I do own more than one jacket. All right, okay. So, who am I? So thank you again for inviting me today. It was always lovely to be able to talk about something we have so much passion around. So, my name is Marc Crawley. I am the founder and director of an organisation called Diversity. I've worked in technology recruitment for 18 years. Always loved to drive fairness in the workplace, even when it wasn't fashionable, right? So even when I was working as a director at Hayes and other organisations, I've always tried to create diverse teams and tried to encourage well-being and try to move away from these recruitment stereotypes that you see quite a bit. I mentioned already, I'm father of an autistic 16-year-old son who's just gone through GCSEs, so we'll see how that works out. He's done brilliantly. In terms of me personally, I'm like the least recruited person ever, obsessed with Disney, Star Wars. Don't get me started on those, genuinely, because we'll be talking all day. And as I've mentioned already, I am destined to be miserable forever as a Tottenham fan. So that's me in a bit of a nutshell. I'm also father of 2 and been married for 24 years, 25 years this year, by the way. So, who are Diversity and what do we do and what do we represent? So essentially we are a purpose-led recruitment business. So our mission, and we spent a lot of time trying to do this statement, it's taken about a year and a bit to try and formulate, is to unlock the potential of neurodivergent talent through tailored recruitment, training and awareness. For us, everything we do springs back to recruitment, right? So there are hundreds, if not thousands, of organisations to focus on neurodiversity awareness, training, etc. But we really want to focus on getting more people into work. So even when we do training, it all springs back to trying to make sure the recruitment process is as inclusive as possible. So, what's our story? I will flick through this quickly. So myself and my wife started Diversity 14 months ago. And it was all about personal passion. So I work in recruitment and wanted to make a difference, genuinely, right? Because I could see all of these big companies having these processes that were just highly prohibitive to neurodivergent candidates and job seekers. But equally so, I was very passionate around contributing to the neurodiverse community. So when we started it, we wanted to do something passion-led, purpose-led, but it had to be practical. It had to be something that really changed things. And we are essentially a family business. When I say myself as a family business, it's myself, my wife Julia, my oldest son, my niece. We'll run out of family members eventually, but at the moment we're predominantly a family business, which is good. So Thomas, as I mentioned already, is autistic and has really again fuels that drive every day for us. So the best way to explain what we do is we are a recruitment agency that assists neurodiverse job seekers only. So we only work with neurodiverse job seekers, and we work with organisations to hire candidates. We also provide extensive training, as I mentioned already. And finally, we started in April 2022, seems a lifetime ago. We now work with over 1,000 candidates and 20 organisations, so really starting to move in the right direction. What we also do, and I know some people might find it a bit strange, is we work with a lot of recruitment companies, including the great people at Big Red, because we feel we can't do this on our own, right? We're only a small company, and recruitment agencies talk to hundreds, if not thousands of candidates every single week. And when we start looking at some of the areas as we go through this slide, for me, recruitment agencies are a bit of a blind spot. Yeah, you have a big focus on ED&I, your focus is in talent acquisition, HR, etc. But recruitment agencies are normally sending a representation of the candidate markets organisations. So to me, they need as much educating as anyone, if not more. So today is not going to be about what is neurodiversity in any sort of in-depth way, but I thought for people who obviously maybe haven't heard of the phrase or maybe a little bit unclear about what it is, I'll give a high-level overview. So essentially, The idea about neurodiversity is about thinking differently. It's a way the brain processes information, takes information in, and essentially it's a different thinking style, or as I say, a way of retaining and processing information. The phrase was coined around 30 years ago by Judy Singer and Harvey Bloom, and their real key focus is that neurodiverse conditions are not there to be fixed. Right? They are just variations on the way the brain works. So to fix someone's neurodivergence, you're essentially changing fundamentally who they are. And we'll talk a little bit more about identity first language later on, and around the way people really are starting to own their neurodivergence, but essentially that's what it is. Some of the more common groups within neurodiversity would be autism, ADHD, dyslexia, Tourette's, dyscalculia, dyspraxia, dysgraphia. But again, they are areas where we're not saying anything, no one is saying anything is fundamentally wrong with someone. These are just different ways of taking and processing information. And this is one of the key reasons we feel the recruitment processes need to change. And forgive me if I keep coming back to recruitment, because that's going to be the sort of centre point of what I talk about today. So, folks, bring up some stats, neurodiversity in the UK workforce. So, just to give you a bit of an idea about what we believe is the sort of the area we're working with here, is it's probably closer to around 1 in 5, but between 1 in 5 and 1 in 6 people in the UK are considered neurodivergent. And that actually takes into account the incredibly low diagnosis rates, particularly with ADHD. I would say that's around 17 to 20% of your existing workforce as well. I don't know what companies you work for, but that's obviously quite a large number potentially. Just under 4.6 million people in UK employment, and we did our own studies, and we had about 2,000 responders, that 78% of the ND applicants that we spoke to have never been offered an adjusted interview process. It's an incredibly high number. What's even more incredible is that 72% of UK companies have never offered neurodiversity training of any type. Now, I do sympathise with a lot of organisations because of the focus around so many different ED&I and D&I pillars. But yeah, again, there's just some stats to work with. Because I work in technology, as in we recruit predominantly technologists at the moment, Big Red do, and I know obviously we have a big focus around technology here. There's some stats that we thought would be useful here. So there's estimated around 1.2 million people in the UK that are employed within IT or tech. We believe this is actually quite a pessimistic number, or conservative number. Around 300,000 people are likely to be neurodivergent, or 25%. What is very difficult to understand is how many trained neurodivergent technologists, so people who come through STEM degrees, etc., are unemployed, or even worse for me, underemployed. As in, they're not given an opportunity to get into organisations, probably because of prohibited practices, etc. But underemployment is one of the key areas that we need more data on. And we estimate around 10% of ND tech candidate population have disclosed to their employer. So, an incredibly low percentage of people that are very likely to be neurodivergent working for companies who don't feel comfortable to disclose as well. So other than all these brilliant reasons I've just put up here, why should companies look to change? First of all, we talked around thinking differently. So a different view across projects in a business. You think about the way an IT project works. There's so many different areas of thinking and creativity that are required. So having a different view across projects in the business can be fantastic. There's a bit of a phrase that I don't really sort of gravitate towards, and diversity tend to steer away from, around superpowers. And looking at, I'd say, these high level of strengths within certain neurodivergent job seekers and employees. What we prefer to focus on is cognitive strengths. So we're talking around quite heavy spikes within, say, a cognitive profile, where we talk around, if you would imagine, for example, and I won't use this phrase often, a neurotypical individual having quite a well-rounded skill set. Some individuals that are, say, autistic or ADHD tend to have some quite high spikes in certain areas, be it analysis, be it creativity, but may struggle in other areas as well. So this is why, as Paul mentioned earlier, we don't really use the phrase high functioning and low functioning anymore. It's just different strengths that are focused on now. Listen, certainly in my space anyway, and I'm sure that it won't take long to get back to this, organisations are quite desperate for tech talent. So looking at alternative candidate pools are really, really interesting, I think, for organisations. And this is the one which really made us start Diversity, and this is why we're a purpose-led business, is that and this has actually gone up, this is actually better than it was, 73% of autistic adults are unemployed in the UK. Just to give that even more context, 16 hours above is considered full-time employment in that area. You compare that to what? Just under 4% of working adults are unemployed. It's a disgusting stat, pardon my phrase, but it really, really is. And there's some great work going on at government, which hopefully will change that from September onwards. But yeah, if you want to make a difference, this is a great area to start. It's also, ACAS is receiving more and more calls than ever regarding ND in the workplace, around prejudiced behaviours, etc. And the world of work has changed, right? It really, really has. There's more opportunities to embrace different working styles and different ways of thinking now as well, with hybrid working, etc. So it's a great way to start. So what I'm trying to talk about today is everything that's practical, right? So there's some areas that I think could really, really help as organisation leaders that I think people who are neurodivergent really struggle with in employment. So there's 4 concepts we'll talk about here. The first one is the idea of quality versus equity. So I'm sure anyone who's on LinkedIn more than 5 minutes has probably seen different slides where you have people, I think there's one where there's like a fence and there's a really tall person, there's someone who's maybe medium height, and then someone a little bit shorter, and they have different sized boxes to try and see over the fence. The idea of equity versus equality is that equity provides, and recognises rather, that not everyone has the same starting position. And when you think about a recruitment process in particular, this is really important. For example, a dyslexic candidate in our space may require more time to be able to process a written test or something like that, or to take in a question and respond in a time that they feel comfortable with. Equity is recognising that not everyone is equal, right? So even the phrase ED&I and DEI is now diversity, equity and inclusion, not equality, right? And it's really important that that's recognised. I've been working in recruitment a long time, like the guys at Big Red, and it used to be, when I started, it was all handshake recruitment. Who do you know? Do you know someone come in? Someone would come in, within 10 seconds you make a decision. Everyone in recruitment teams would, everyone in IT teams would probably look like me. It was a real sort of backward step in terms of diversity. And then I'd say around the 2010s to 20s, it was focused on equality. All right, trying to make sure everyone had the same opportunity to apply for roles, the same type of interview questions, the same type of processes. But it's not fit for purpose anymore. And the organisations I talk to a lot are still very much ingrained in equality. Well, it's not fair to give someone questions in advance, right? It's not fair to try and give someone an interview and not put a camera on, etc. So equity is a really, really important concept to understand. As is ableism. So ableism is essentially refers to the bias, prejudice and discrimination against people with disabilities, and it hinges on the idea that people with disabilities are less valuable than non-disabled people. I'll try and give you the best example I can, which I heard recently. So I was talking to a dyslexic sort of technologist who worked in IT support, and this guy was great, and he even put on his signature, "I'm powered by dyslexia," right? So please forgive any grammatical or spelling mistakes. And he sent out a mail about people not locking their keyboards, right? So people walking away from their keyboards, any old nonsense could happen, etc. So he sent out this mail saying, please lock your computers. Quite a few grammatical errors, if you were going to be sort of a sort of grammatical nerd or anything like that. But ultimately, it was fully understandable, this email. So his manager decided, though, do you know what I'm going to do? Every email you send from now on, send to me and I'll proofread it for you. So this is a really ableist way of dealing with the situation. Rather than trying to raise awareness within the organisation to say, look, there's going to be a few errors in here, but the email's understood, right? This is a prime example of ableism, where you end up sort of doing something for someone. I was guilty of it as with my son, Thomas. Rather than trying to embrace his strengths, I would do things for him, right? Stuff like that. So trying to move away from this type of help, or I suppose trying to do the right thing but misjudging it, is really, really important to understand. And there you go, usually manifests itself when taking over. So another key concept here to talk about is masking. So masking is, so what is considered masking when discussing neurodiversity It's essentially a survival tool for neurodivergent individuals within a predominantly neurotypical society. If there's no disclosure, it can be a way of coping with school and work. So what disclosure is when you talk quite openly around who you are as a neurodivergent individual. And a lot of people, as we recognise in one of the previous stats, don't do that within an organisation. So people will mask because they want to avoid stigma and questions, they want to have a sense of belonging. But most of the examples of what we hear is because people are not comfortable talking about their organisation because of fear of prejudice, right, or fear of lack of understanding. And masking to me is the most heartbreaking concept. It really is, because what we see quite a bit is people that mask, they try and conceal where they are, and then they fundamentally become a different person, and even that person, because it's obviously not authentic, is not accepted. So imagine that, you try and be someone different, you try and fit in, and even then you're not accepted by your organisation. So masking is a really interesting one, and it comes down to really making sure your organisation is one where people feel comfortable to disclose. And the last concept we'll talk around before we go into a few more specifics is phrasing and language. And this is the one where people get all tongue-tied when I talk to them, particularly organisations, and it's quite sweet, but ultimately it's quite important to try and educate yourself around the right terminologies. So now, it's just to say that some people have different preferences in terms of terminologies, but these are the ones that we see most commonly used. So the phrase neurodiversity itself, a couple of good ways to use it is I am interested in neurodiversity. We have a policy focusing on neurodiversity, so we're talking about the area in general. Neurodivergent, so this is the one where we see people maybe struggle. Essentially, when you say the word neurodivergent, it's about talking about an individual, right? So we are working with a neurodivergent technologist. This group is for people who consider themselves neurodivergent. It's when you talk about someone very specific. So you wouldn't say a group of people are neurodivergent, for example. Neurodivergence, again, so we're talking about in groups in this sense, we're looking at accommodate all types of neurodivergence. Anxiety is considered a neurodivergence. And neurodiverse. We humans are a neurodiverse species. We should have a more neurodiverse leadership team. So I think Paul is going to share these slides afterwards, of course, as well. Neurodistinct. So neurodistinct is one that we really like. It's got a lot of traction within the US at the moment. So it's a replacement really for neurodivergent. And so Emma is a neurodistinct applicant. I am neurodistinct. The other key area to really focus on for us is the idea of identity first language. So identity first language is really powerful within the neurodiverse community at the moment. Because again, it goes back to what we said right at the start about fundamentally owning who you are as a neurodivergent individual. So we see phrases like this being used quite commonly now. You use I am autistic. People say I am autistic as opposed to I have autism or I suffer from autism. My dyslexic son Billy rather than my son Billy who's dyslexic. My ADHD, my dyspraxic friend Sally, I identify as dyscalculic. So identity first language is really powerful for people at the moment because again, it really adds weight to the fact that it's not something to be fixed. Person first language is an area that people are moving away from. However, I will say that, for example, my son actually prefers to say he has autism. It's totally his choice, right? But if I was going to make a recommendation, it would be, if I was going to presume at all, it would be to use identity first language. My friend is a person with autism. You have a condition called Tourette, so you're someone that has dyspraxia. So person first language tends to put the, I suppose, the condition separate. However, while some things are subjective, there are things that are totally incorrect, and these are areas that we really, really don't want to be mentioning. You are amazing considering what you have. Like my dad uses this all the time with my son, right? It really, really is. And bless him, right? He's trying, right? He really is, right? But he's 71, he's from Bermondsey, and maybe he's not as worldly as he maybe should be. And he tries to do it from a good place, right? My friend suffers from autism. You hear this one all the time. You want to know you have ADHD. You seem fine, etc. So again, we don't want to hear phrases like that. You'll grow out of it. My granddad was convinced my son was going to grow out of it as well. In fact, he thought he was artistic as opposed to autistic. And the last one is everyone is a little autistic. Now, what's interesting about this one is there is some science coming through which may support that in some ways, but what it does, it diminishes people's journey, it diminishes what they're going through. And again, it comes across very, very ableist, where you're trying to empathise with the individual. So you want to try and move away from those type of phrases as well. So, okay, there's a big old banner just to make sure you understand, right? So neurodivergent strengths and challenges. So at Diversita, we really, really focus around strengths. But what we also do is we really, really make sure that organisations understand that they need to accommodate these strengths by making adjustments in the workplace as well. So, I know people can't probably read this. I didn't know it was going to come out as small as this, but I was recently sent a recruitment guide by this massive organisation who I work with down in London. I won't mention who they are because it's not fair, but there's a lot of things on here that I just wanted people, if they could have read it, to maybe give me some feedback. But it talks around, this is what managers are given prior to an interview for an individual with autism. So there's some things on here that say sensory challenges, the candidate may struggle in an interview setting, difficulty with small talk and social interactions. You may find the individual be non-verbal communication difficulties. Autistic individuals may struggle with interpreting and using non-verbal cues. They may struggle effectively communicating their abilities and require additional support or guidance in articulating their qualifications. Just as a general rule, can anyone tell me what's fairly consistent throughout all of these?
It all feels negative. They might struggle with, to play on the strengths.
Absolutely, it's exactly that. And do you know what? They've got one for everyone. They've got one for ADHD, dyslexia, and they're all like this. They all focus on the negatives. Nothing's focusing around strengths at all. And that education piece, and I'm sure there are so many recruitment guides going around which are like this. They really, really are. So we're trying to move away from this. So what I wanted to talk about today was some of the strengths that we see. Now again, it's very individual, but these are some of the more generic strengths we see. Talking to sort of hundreds of candidates every week. So some of the autistic strengths that we see from individuals tend to relate to detailed analysis, linear and logical thinking, or bottom-up thinking as we call it, identifying patterns, designing systems, heightened senses, and some really good executive functioning skills, so operating well within a corporate environment. What's really interesting about these is that we often see these articles about someone's just saved IBM like £1 million or something or £1 billion rather, by noticing some patterns. We try and move away from that by saying that there are some areas within autistic strengths that do gravitate well to data analysis in areas, but they tend to be more around system design, etc., from the bottom upwards. So autistic strengths are really, really interesting. Some of the big misconceptions around autism that we see, and we've mentioned this already, autistic individuals are high functioning or low functioning. Again, we need to move away from that. Someone can be cured. No, it doesn't work like that. I have to be honest, when Thomas was diagnosed, I thought only boys were autistic, and that was only like 14 years ago. But no, it's just because of low diagnosis rates with girls. Only children autistic? No, again, because it normally manifests itself in easy to spot diagnosis traits. Vaccines cause autism. I don't know, people like me may remember the MMR, and we used to hear a lot about that was causing autism. And the last one, and everyone seems to think this when I talk to them, is autistic people are great at counting toothpicks and cards in Vegas. Listen, some people might be, but again, it's not a consistent trait, right? So we want to move away from these. Strengths of ADHD. So what we see with ADHD is, I don't know, some real big picture type strengths. So creative thinking, big picture thinking, hyperfocus, identifying visual patterns, really normally very good social and communication skills and heightened senses. What's interesting about strengths of ADHD is that a few of them are also some of the challenges. For example, hyperfocus. So I myself, from very early on in the ADHD diagnosis process, and hyperfocus is one of those things which is incredible for me between 6 a.m. and 2 p.m. Then I fall asleep, and then I wake up again around 4 o'clock and I can go again. But that hyperfocus is really, really important to understand as well, but it can be a real strength. What is interesting about hyperfocus is it does not really fit very well into a normal day working pattern as well, so it's really important to understand that as well. So ADHD common misconceptions. We often hear it isn't a real condition. Children just being naughty. Individuals with ADHD can never focus. The exact opposite, as we mentioned with hyperfocus. Again, it leans towards boys. Only boys have ADHD, and ADHD is a learning disability. No, none of these are true as well. And the last one I'll give you a little bit more information around is dyslexia. Very similar actually in terms of the type of strengths we see with ADHD. Again, very good at identifying visual patterns, design techniques, lateral thinking. And what's interesting, I spoke to a C++ developer who's dyslexic, and he said he really struggled grammatically at school, really struggled with essays, etc. But when he looked at C++, he just got it. It just worked for him. It really did. So alternative methods of visual communication can be really powerful. Again, some of the misconceptions. Reading and writing letters backwards means you're dyslexic, not necessarily. It can sometimes manifest itself in information processing, delays in that, etc. It doesn't mean you cannot read and write. It might mean you need a little bit more time to do so. It's definitely not an eyesight problem, and it's definitely not caused by a below average intelligence, which is one of the most common stories we hear with people around my age who've gone through a late diagnosis about the way they were treated at school. As well, and dyslexia can be cured. It can't. It's a lifelong condition. So we're going to talk a little bit more about the recruitment challenges now, and this is our sweet spot, right? This is where we really try and make sure organisations understand change. So we've split into three areas, and again, this is about high-level practical advice today. Please feel free to reach out to either myself or to Big Red afterwards. But one of the key challenges I see early on are job specifications. I really do. I think Selfridges spend about £3-4 million a year on their windows for Christmas every year. And I think companies must spend about a tenner, I think, on job specs sometimes. Cut and paste, there's very little policing around who produces them, etc. Not everyone, of course, right? But a lot of companies, I don't think give these the respect they deserve. But one of the key challenges I find is how organisations use subjective requirements in job specs and how companies also promote culture. I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean. Subjective requirements, examples. Looking for a driven individual, right? Or we're looking for a real go-getter area. We're looking for someone who can really sort of push the boat out and an area that's very difficult to quantify. Applicant must have excellent communication skills. Now, I don't actually mind this one, as long as you explain why you need great communication skills, as opposed to you just have to have them, right? We just want people coming in. And explain what that means as well. Is it great communication skills on a day-to-day basis with your team? Is it with people? It's too generic. Candidates should be flexible around business needs. Again, we see this a lot, and again, it's highly subjective. It really is. Looking for a good culture fit. I don't even know what that means anymore, but again, we need to try and move away from these types of subjective areas. Some other ones, this is one, oh my word, this one really got me. I was dealing with this financial services company, and they took it even further. Candidates should have a good sense of humour. In the interview, I'm trying not to swear, but they asked the candidates to tell a joke as well. So it's like, anyway, we need to try and move away from that as well. So it doesn't matter if they've got a good sense of humour, and even what that is only subjective anyway. Candidates should have excellent written skills, very similar to communication skills. But if you are, let me just go back a second now. If you see these type of things and you're a neurodivergent candidate, I've got to be honest, they're going to put you off. They really are. So if these type of things are written in your job specs at the moment, you really need to rethink about what you're actually trying to attract in terms of talent. So, subjective requirements, I mentioned already, they'll alienate a large percentage of neurodivergent applicants. Requirements that focus on speed and written ability will also drive away candidates. We always hear about culture in some of these job specs, but they never miss the point of what culture is. And there's not enough positive, more inclusive soft requirements in specs. Talking about belonging, right? Talking about real authentic things that organisations do to support their employees is really important. So, as I mentioned already, if you do need to have subjective requirements, be it written communication skills, which are important in some roles, and great communication skills, really try and explain why. It's really important. Cultural benefits. This is another one which is is slightly more difficult to push back on companies around, but it can be really alienating, particularly for autistic applicants, and these are all examples, right, of some audits we did for companies. This is a highly social environment with visits to Marbella, Vegas, wherever it is, every year, right? All of these places that I personally don't want to go either. We encourage all employees to be active in company initiatives. There's a game room for lunchtime fun and exercise. We have spectacular summer and Christmas parties that employees look forward to all year long. Now, with all of these, if you're going to do these, please make clear they're optional, right? And they're not ingrained in your company culture, because a lot of people don't want to do these things. They don't, and they'll see that and they'll think, oh, I want to go there. Then I have to make excuses for this. I'm going to have to do that. It's just not who I am. It's not what I enjoy doing. Right? I want to go in, I want to do a great job for this organisation, but I don't want to do this. Now, not everyone is like this. I understand that. And this is why it's important to make sure that if you want to promote these type of benefits, just make sure they're optional. Yeah, it really, really is important. So some quick wins here. Make it clear that the benefits are optional, maybe consider some alternatives, something outside of just going on the piss in Marbella. Focus on skill rather than subjective requirements. When I say that one, it's really stripping back your job specs to make it think, okay, what do we actually need this person to do in this job, right? What do we actually need for them to achieve? Shout about inclusivity initiatives at the company. Try to give some idea of the interview process on the specification as well. I see so many job specs that have got nothing around the interview process. And again, candidates would love to know how long this interview is going to be. Another key part of this, of the recruitment process that I think is often overlooked, is what the application process. So this is everything between someone who's reading a job spec and the interview. So all these bits in between. So what are the challenges here for me? The key problem that I think we need to try and solve is it's very rarely individualized and there's too many variables. Particularly with big companies, you have these heavy disconnects between someone applying and the CV actually getting to someone. And there's so many decisions going on there through either applicant tracking systems or through local decision making or areas that aren't fully quantified, that I think this can really, really cause anxiety in the interview process. So the initial process can be stage heavy for CVs to be reviewed. So I don't know the individuals in this room how many people actually review CVs, but I've worked with companies where it can be up to 3 or 4 different people review a CV. Because of this, it can be very, very difficult to discuss accommodations. And we'll talk about adjustments in a moment and reasonable adjustments. But accommodations and an individual conversation about the candidate can be really tough. Are candidates applying to a client or via an agency that has any understanding of neurodiversity? I was speaking to Adam earlier at Big Red, and he was saying that when he was promoting this or talking to organisations, someone asked, what is neurodiversity? And he felt fully comfortable talking around this subject. That's so important. It really, really is. So if you work with recruitment agencies, just please make sure they have an understanding of neurodiversity, because again, they're representing your brand every day. Would candidates feel comfortable to disclose? So do you have an organisation and do you have a process where people feel comfortable to disclose around their neurodivergence as well? And how are applicants managed, and how will neurodivergent candidates be considered? So you do have a process in place once someone does disclose to you about what you do from that point onwards, right? I was at a candidate the other day that disclosed to a well-known supermarket brand. I won't say they are, but they disclosed and then nothing happened. Right? The interview just went ahead as normal. And I thought, well, this is a big deal for me. I've disclosed that I'm autistic, and yet nothing's happened from that perspective onwards. So is it for internal tracking that these questions or application forms, or is it to actually define action? So how do clients or agencies manage to facilitate a range of diversity considerations? That's tough as well, and I do understand that already. There's a lot of different areas to try and focus on. Who is making the decision on what candidates to shortlist? Again, let's make sure that's a process which is fair. We've talked about what point the process is individualised. Who is making the decision for the final candidate to be interviewed as well? This is so important, it really is. Who is actually saying, these are the candidates we're going to interview out of the 20 or 30 CVs we've had in, and what does that process look like? And one of the more interesting challenges we have are referrals. So people who recommend their friends, people who recommend individuals to come into their organisation. This can be really, really diminishing to trying to create a diverse workforce as well. So the question I would ask today is, where possible in our processes at the moment, can we have an individual conversation about this candidate? And I think if there's one takeaway that I would probably try and say today, it's one of those. It really is. Look at our processes now. Where can we have an individual conversation around this person? And can it be as early as possible? So a few quick wins here. First of all, review how many people were involved in the pre-interview process, right? How many people were reviewing CVs? How many people are having to look, how many application internal processes are things going through? Give thoughts on how you manage rejection of candidates as well. It's really important because it can be a really big deal. Again, particularly for autistic candidates, if they get rejected. Consider candidates for more than one role, can always help, it really can internally, and have a process for candidates to be open around neurodiversity at application stage. Again, you need to be comfortable with this, but it is really important that you try and make sure that candidates feel comfortable and that action will be taken after that. Some quick wins. Is the application process too disconnected from the applicant? Again, make sure to try and narrow it as much as possible. But one of my favourite ones is focus on small changes. Neurodiversity is a big concept, it really is, and it can be really, really scary. Most organisations look at it from the top down, so they focus on quite high-level ED&I initiatives, etc., rather than making a small change which starts to give a better candidate experience. So this is why we focus on recruitment, because we think that's the entry point to organisations. Just going to talk very briefly about reasonable adjustments as well. So organisations, if they don't, they should have a reasonable adjustment process in place. And again, this is adding equity to the interview and application process, which we've talked about before. Making adjustments outside of your normal process to make sure that neurodiverse candidates get the best opportunity to be the best version of themselves during an interview. What's great to hear, most are completely free. They really are, and probably will not impact the interview process and qualification process. So a few quick examples. With autism, it tends to be sensory, communicative, preparation and understanding. What that means is a lot of our autistic applicants love to know in detail what's going to happen on the day, who's going to be interviewing me, who's going to pick me up from reception. If I'm on a virtual call, can it be, we can have my camera off, etc. What's the room going to be like? Is it going to have natural lighting? Is there going to be a fluorescent light in my face the whole time? These type of things are really, really important to understand. So you can't almost over-communicate in this instance. Dyslexia tends to be time, visual and understanding. It really does. So the concept of time comes up quite a lot in what we talk about. And it can mean, I had a candidate quite recently who had quite a distinct 5-second delay how they answer questions. So even verbally, right? So someone would ask a question and then it would be long time, right? It's like 5 seconds. So if there was no understanding prior to that, it may be a little bit sort of unnerving for the interviewer. So it's really, really important to have these conversations in advance. ADHD, time, patience and understanding. The key request we get for time with individuals with ADHD, you might see this with me a little bit as well, is people with ADHD have a lot of ideas and can come up with some great initiatives during the interview process. So we try and give a bit more breathing space on the interview. So if people go off in different areas, which is fantastic, you don't have the restriction of the normal amount of time during these interviews. So it's really, really important to recognise if someone's ADHD wants more time or you get requesting more time, that you try and embrace that. But what we see in all of these is understanding, right? And this starts with neurodiversity awareness. This starts with everyone involved in the recruitment process is having a conversational understanding around neurodiversity. So the understanding piece is really, really important here as well. And the last one we'll talk about is Tourette's. Again, it comes down to understanding, comes down to time, because obviously individuals with Tourette's sometimes take a little bit longer to communicate. But again, an understanding around how people communicate as well. So, my big takeaway from reasonable adjustments is I would look at your interview processes and think about what you can offer now, rather than simply waiting to be asked. There's nothing worse than if a candidate asks for something and you say, no, we can't do that. No, we can't accommodate that. It's really important to understand what you can offer. Having a list of things that you know 100% you can offer is so powerful, and everyone buys into it, right? So you've got all of the business buying into it, you've got human resources buying into it. That's fantastic. It's a great starting point. You're not going to cover everything, but to actually have that is really, really powerful as well. Right, last thing I'll talk about is the interview process, and we'll talk about this quite briefly. So, key problem that we were trying to solve here when we entered this is it's incredibly rare that neurodiverse candidates have a positive interview experience. Really, it's really, for the most part, incredibly negative. So, some of the challenges here: lack of detailed feedback after the interview. He wasn't quite the right fit for us, or if anything at all, or a standard rejection letter. It's not good enough. Not good enough for neurodivergent applicants. Yeah, you need to make sure that you give them detailed feedback as to why they weren't successful. Agencies not delivering feedback accurately. So even if you work for an organisation, you give the recruitment agency the feedback and they soften it or neuter it or anything like that, that's not what's needed here. Yeah, it's really important to make sure that people get accurate feedback as to why they're not successful. Are interviewers and people leaders really driven to diversify their team while interviewing? So what are the internal agendas around creating diverse teams? Really, really important to understand. Lack of information regarding the format. So someone turns up to the interview and they don't know what it's going to be about. They don't know what type of questions they're going to get asked, etc. And vice versa, the interviewer is not prepared for the interview. These are big challenges we find at the moment. And again, adjustments not being offered with conviction, right? So it's all very well offering them, but offer them because you genuinely believe in them as well. So some quick wins around the interview process. Where possible, always agree timelines with everyone internally and try and stick to these. We see, again, particularly for autistic applicants, timelines extending over weeks, etc., can be really, really challenging. One of the biggest misconceptions we have is when organisations say, well, would you prefer we space out the interviews a little bit for someone? A lot of the time that's worse because it increases the anxiety level over a period of time. It's better to have a concentrated period over a number of weeks. So it's really, really important. Likewise, with the candidates interviewing, try to avoid change where you can. There's going to be things that are unavoidable, I get that. But it's really important to make sure you have quite a robust process where people, for the most part, stick to timelines. Review the process and look at consolidating stages where possible. Comes back to the first point about making sure we reduce the anxiety around this. But there's always a balance, right? Try not to overwhelm. Just don't get someone in for like a recruitment day or something like that where they've got like 7 hours of interview. So it's always a bit of a balance. But if you've got 7 hours of interview, you might need to rethink that as well, right? So, and please have a plan in place for your people leaders to have a conversational understanding of neurodiversity. I've got to be honest. We talk to dozens of companies every week, and a lot of the time it's driven by ED&I, right? It's driven by high-level initiatives about someone who really wants to drive this through their company. Then HR and talent acquisition get involved, and it's fantastic. It really is. Suddenly there's policies in place, and then it falls down with the business. It really does a lot of the time. Now, I'm not saying it always will, but having all three of those in unison is really, really important. But it starts with having that understanding. It really does. So some final thoughts from me. So this is actually a quote from, 2% of our profits goes to a charity called the ADHD Foundation, which is the largest neurodiversity charity in the UK. And their CEO, Tony Lloyd, uses this phrase, and I love it. It's a fear of a different mindset drives exclusion on a professional level. The 20% that view the world in a different way should be represented around the decision-making table. Dynamic leaders and organisations should be capable of questioning pre-existing beliefs that are comfortable, legacy and familiar. And this last part, the comfortable, legacy and familiar part, is the one that really resonates with me, because there is going to be a little bit of pain, there is going to be a little bit of a shift, there is going to be some additional learning. But think about these 20% of these candidates that are coming through your door every day that will get a much better candidate experience because of that. Thank you so much. Any questions?